Okay, everybody, this is going to be a video about Plato's views on obeying the law. The law in question here is what's sometimes called the positive law, or law created by human beings, specifically by governments. It's what we ordinarily think of as law. The reason to distinguish positive law as a kind of law is that there have been many who have thought there's a kind of thing called natural law. Natural law is law that is normally said to have its source not in human beings, but in God. The idea is God created nature, and along with it, God created rules of behavior for things that live in nature. Thinking about natural law and obeying natural law is related to that issue that arose with the Euthyphro. And remember that Plato's position in the Euthyphro is fairly clearly the following. Everything that God commands you to do, or the gods command you to do, you should do. Plato thinks you have a duty to obey God's commands, but not because God makes what's right and wrong right and wrong. So remember, in the Euthyphro, Plato's debating Euthyphro, who believes that just the gods loving something makes it a good thing. And Plato thinks, no, it's good. If a thing's good, it's good on its own, independent of what the gods love or don't love. It's just true that the gods love all the good things and they hate the bad things. Right? So Plato believes you have an obligation to obey the gods, but that this obligation isn't explained by the gods. Gods don't make morality true. It's just one of the moral rules that you should do what the gods tell you, right? You can think of it as analogous to your parents, right? When you're a kid, you might think the right thing to do is what your parents tell you to do. But that's not because your parents create morality, right? It's not like they've made it true that murdering people is bad or that stealing is bad. They're just telling you. So that's Plato's view about obeying the gods. But what about obeying human authorities? To examine his views on this, we're just going to focus on two dialogues of his, the Apology, and the Crito. The word apology the English word apology comes from the Greek word apologia, which means a defense. So there is this sort of strange thing where a word that originally meant defending yourself, apologizing would have been to defend yourself, has now turned into admitting you were wrong, so not defending yourself. This is one of the weird things that happens with language. So in the Apology, Socrates, this is often called the Apology of Socrates. Socrates is not apologizing. Socrates is defending himself against accusations. And in the process, we learn a good bit about what Socrates thought about a duty to obey the law. This raises a complication. And the complication here is that it might be that in the Apology, we're getting Socrates' views, but not Plato's views. Right? So this problem always arises with Plato, what's really Plato's view and what's not. And different scholars have different views about when Plato is giving you his own personal views and when he's giving you the views of the historical Socrates. I will say that of all the dialogues, the one most likely to contain views that Socrates held that maybe Plato didn't was the Apology. It was the first thing Plato ever published. And it was published fairly quickly, or fairly soon after the trial of Socrates actually happened. And so as a result, a lot of people who were there at the trial would have, read this and been able, presumably, to say that Plato was making things up if Plato wasn't saying with some accuracy what actually happened. So the Apology might just be what Socrates said, and maybe Plato doesn't agree with it. But for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to treat everything that Plato says in the dialogues as Plato's view. Anyway, the problems that arise when you look at the Apology next to the Crito are interesting. It leads you to examine certain interesting questions and ideas. The Crito takes place after the Apology, like a month afterward. Socrates is in prison, and his friend, Crito, has come to bust him out. Not even really bust him out. His friend bribed the guard. Said, here, let's just go. And in the course of the Crito, Socrates argues for the claim that he shouldn't leave, that he should not leave prison contrary to the law. Okay. So why look at these two together? Well, for one thing, they both concern this really important event in Plato's life, the trial and execution of Socrates. They seem to have been written around the same time, and they're both really famous. If you want to know why Socrates became as well known as he did, it's in large part because of Plato writing these two things. These two works made Socrates a sort of ethical hero for lots of people. And he still has that impact on people today. I'm not going to talk about everything that happens in the Apology because the Apology is just chock full of stuff. I'm here in this video going to talk a little bit more about what happens in the Crito. But I do want to point out a few things that Socrates says in the Apology that bear on this question. Should we always obey the law, and why should we obey the law? So in the Apology, Plato relates Socrates as saying a bunch of things. For example, you should never violate the command of your superiors. He says it in relation to military situations. If your commander tells you to hold your ground at some spot in a battle, you should do that. You shouldn't run away because you're afraid of dying. He also says it in relation to the gods. If the gods command you to do something, you should do that thing even if it leads you to risk dying. This is a way of explaining why Socrates is not prepared to do what the people of Athens demand he do effectively, which is stop doing philosophy. Technically, he's on trial for corrupting the youth and for being an atheist, but as he makes pretty clear, that's not really what's going on. What he claims is really going on is he's developed a reputation over the course of his life for being a busybody who asks people questions that they don't want to answer, demands explanations of people of behaviors they don't want to have to give an account of. And that's why he's being brought on trial. Socrates seems to be suggesting that he's being brought on trial because he's obnoxious. And he tries to explain why he's being obnoxious, and there's lots of interesting stuff there. The context for this is actually probably the reason Socrates was being put on trial, is Socrates was friends with some people who had overthrown the Athenian democracy briefly, and he was just getting caught up in a political purge. But put all that to one side. Socrates says that even under the threat of death, he is not prepared to stop doing philosophy. Why? Well, because he believes that's what the god has told him to do. And the god here is presumably Apollo, because he's saying this in relation to what the oracle at Delphi, which was a temple dedicated to Apollo, said about him. Okay, so in the Apology, Socrates says that he is going to defy the will of the people in order to do the will of God. And he says this in relation to a more general principle, which is that you should always obey your superiors. Always obey your superiors. And so there's a really straightforward way to take this. One easy way to understand Socrates' position here is that Socrates thinks God, or gods, have given him a command. That command conflicts with what the people of Athens have effectively commanded. And the gods are a higher authority than the people of Athens, so Socrates is going to obey the gods. His position here would be very similar to lots of people who have, throughout history, claimed that the law of God trumps the law of man, and as a result, you You don't have to obey the government when it calls on you to violate your own religious convictions. Okay. But it's not just that. I mean, for one thing, it's not even quite that, because even in Socrates' own story, he's never told to do the thing he's doing. All that happened was the oracle said, Socrates is the wisest man alive, and then Socrates sought to disprove the oracle by finding someone wiser, and that's why he goes around and talks to people the way he does. He wants to find somebody who's wiser than himself. And then very humbly he says, I've never found anybody. Turns out the oracle was right. So for one thing, there's no clear-cut command he's obeying. Another reason to question whether this is really what's going on is there are other cases where Socrates defied the will of the government. He relates some of them. He defied the will of the government when it was a democracy. He defied the will of the government when it was a tyranny. He was given orders and he didn't carry them out. Why? Because he thought they were wrong. He thought in so doing he would be violating someone's, I was about to say someone's rights, but that's a very contemporary way of thinking about it. Basically, what Socrates thinks is he would have been unjustly harming someone if he had followed the laws in those cases. So, what it seems like Socrates' position is in the Apology is that you can legitimately defy the law if it conflicts with your own moral convictions, not just your religious convictions, with your own moral convictions. And really, in the end, given what he said in the Euthyphro, that has to be what's going on, just period, right? Because, of course, because he believes the gods don't make moral claims true or false. They're true or false on their own. Even when he's doing what a god tells him to do, even when he thinks he's being given a command by the god, that principle that says always do what the gods say is a moral principle that Socrates accepts sort of on its own merits. And so in the end, the position in the Apology is that, or what it seems to be, is that you can defy the law when it conflicts with morality. Specifically, you can defy the law when it asks you to treat other people in an unjust way. So, that is a position that is presumably familiar to all of you. It is a position that in more recent times was held by people engaged in civil disobedience during the civil rights era, such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., right? So a letter from a Birmingham jail basically says, look, if the law tells you not to do this, but it's the right thing to do, if justice demands you do it and the law says don't do it, you should break the law. Here, what Plato is saying is the law as enacted by human beings is not the ultimate authority. And you can sort of see how that follows, or would seem to follow, from what he had to say in the Euthyphro. In the Euthyphro, he denies that the gods are the ultimate authority. And he seems to do so because he thinks that this would make moral truths, in some sense, arbitrary or unreal. If you want to believe, or if you believe, that it's wrong to do something, say murder somebody. And one of the things that Socrates was commanded to do but didn't do, as he says in the Euthyphro, was effectively to murder someone. The 30 tyrants, and that's the group of people who overthrew the Athenian democracy and tried to rule it as a tyranny, or really as an oligarchy, since there were 30 of them. When the 30 tyrants commanded him to go get that guy, Leon of Salamis, Socrates knew what was going to happen. He was going to be taking part in a murder. He was going to deliver somebody up to people who would kill him. So let's say you think it's wrong to murder someone. It's wrong to kill an innocent person. Socrates actually goes much farther in some cases and says things along the lines of it's wrong to harm anyone ever, but let's just focus on a more or a less controversial moral claim. It's wrong to murder people. Well, if the gods got to decide what moral truths were true and which weren't, then saying that it's wrong to murder people is just a way of saying, well, the gods don't want you to do it. But there's nothing in and of itself wrong with murdering people. The gods could have decided a totally different way. But if you really want to believe that there's something inherently wrong with murdering people, Plato seems to say, then you can't think that the gods are the ultimate authority on morality. In the sense that the gods can't be responsible for making moral truths true. They're the ultimate authority in the sense that they always know the right answer. They always know what is right to do and what's wrong to do. But they're not the ultimate authorities in the sense of making the moral truths true. And if that's the case, then kind of obviously the laws of human beings are not going to have that status. The laws of human beings aren't even going to always be correct the way that the laws of the gods are. And so you have what seems to me anyway, a fairly consistent position across the Euthyphro and the Crito. The laws of morality are true. They're true independent of what anyone says or anyone thinks. And so when the law conflicts, when human law conflicts with morality, you should do what morality says, because in that case, the human law has no authority. But then we get to the Crito. So the situation is Socrates is in prison awaiting execution. He's awaiting execution because he was convicted of crimes that he believes he did not commit, and it's pretty clear he didn't commit. And so the city is in the process, the city of Athens is in the process of violating a moral rule. The law is wrong. Socrates is convinced. But nonetheless, contrary to what you might expect from the Euthyphro and the Apology, Socrates thinks he has a duty to stay in prison and allow himself to be killed. So this creates a puzzle. How do we get a consistent view across the Apology and the Crito? And more broadly, how do we get a consistent view across the Euthyphro, the Apology, and the Crito? How do we get, how can we defend this fairly strong duty to obey the law that Socrates defends in the Crito, while at the same time defending his view that moral truths are true independently of what anyone thinks and that human law can get it wrong? Well, to see that, we're going to have to take a closer look at the Crito and what it says. All right, so here's the Crito. It opens up with Crito explaining the situation to him. Basically, there's this thing about a ship, and once the ship gets into Athens, then they can, kill Socrates. And the ship's been sighted, so it's going to come any day now. They have a little bit of debate about how long it's going to be. Crito explains to him, I can get you out right now. Right? So let's do it. And Socrates refuses to go, right? And demands that Crito prove that it's okay for him to go, that it's morally acceptable for him to escape. And Crito goes into several arguments. For one thing, he says here, and here we can use the Stephanus pagination at 44c, roughly, that it's going to hurt his reputation and the reputation of his friends if people think that they could have saved Socrates for just a little bit of money, and they don't. And Socrates' response is, well, we shouldn't care what people think. Caring about your reputation is a mistake. And Crito says, well, yeah, but you need to pay attention to your reputation. After all, you, Socrates, didn't pay much attention to your reputation, and look where it got you. And Socrates, making a sort of reference to the things he had said in the Apology, says, well, I'm not really being harmed by this. Remember, Socrates' position is death is not a harm for the person who suffers death if they're doing it for the right reasons. But he says here, a comment I'm going to come back to later, would that the majority could inflict the greatest evils, for then they would be capable of the greatest good, and that would be fine, but now they cannot do either. They cannot make a man either wise or foolish, but they inflict things haphazardly. This is one of a number of occasions where Plato has Socrates say pretty critical things about the majority, about majority rule, about the wisdom of majorities. And that's going to be relevant because, of course, Athens is a democracy. it's the democracy in a sense, right? Most people can't vote. Women and foreigners can't vote at all. And if you're sufficiently poor that you can't take part in the military of Athens, right? If you can't serve in the military because you can't afford like the stuff, you also effectively can't vote. But among people who can vote, everyone had an equal vote, and they voted on things directly. Everybody got into the assembly to vote on legislation directly. Athens was a direct democracy if you were a man, and or a direct democracy among men, let's say, which means less than half the population, right? Because women are half the population on their own, and then there were a lot of men who couldn't vote because usually they were foreigners or slaves. But among the people that could vote, everybody had an equal vote, which meant majority ruled. And so Socrates is insulting the wisdom of majorities really early on here. And Crito responds, okay, but let's focus on other reasons, right? And so he gives some other reasons here. And he basically, one of the more important arguments he makes is that it is not just what you are doing, Socrates, to give up your life when you can save it, and to hasten your fate as your enemies would hasten it, and indeed have hastened it in their wish to destroy you. Moreover, I think you are betraying your sons by going away and leaving them when you could bring them up and educate them. You thus show no concern for what their fate may be. They will probably have the usual fate of orphans. Either one should not have children, or one should share with them to the end of toil and upbringing and education. You seem to me to choose the easiest path, whereas one should choose the path a good and courageous man would choose, particularly when one claims throughout one's life to care for virtue. So there's an argument. There's really two arguments there. One, Socrates is helping his enemies, men who are presumably bad men, and also he's failing in his duties to his family. And those are, especially the second one, fairly powerful arguments. Fairly powerful arguments that Socrates doesn't deal with in any serious way throughout this dialogue. He instead responds to Crito with his own sort of general counter-argument. Now that general counter-argument begins with sort of further arguments in favor of ignoring the advice of the many. Basically saying, and this is an argument that's very common throughout Plato's work, that we shouldn't care what most people think, we should care what experts think. And Crito agrees to that. Then he asks Crito, basically, what would happen? What harm would we encounter if we ignored experts? So he said, like, let's say you went to the doctor, an expert who told you to change your diet, right? Change the way you were eating. What kind of harm would result from ignoring the doctor and instead doing what most other people do? And Crito says, well, you'd hurt your body. And then Socrates asks, okay, well, what about when it comes to moral commands rather than commands about health? What gets harmed then? And Crito says, well, our soul, right? And what Socrates then says is, okay, so here's the situation. If I do something that's wrong, I will hurt my soul and make my life not worth living. And so then everything turns on whether or not it's right or wrong to obey the demands coming from the city. And that's what the rest of the dialogue is going to be about. It's not going to be about an examination of special duties that people have to their children, which is a shame because that issue is an interesting one all its own. And it's also peculiar because it seems like Socrates is only responding to one half of the moral situation. By dying, he is going to leave his wife and his children in a fairly precarious position. Women found it difficult to be independent, like breadwinners in Athenian society, so much so that despite the fact that Socrates' wife is alive, Crito treats it as though his sons will be effectively orphans if Socrates dies. Because, like, what's their mother going to do? She can't own property. She can't do all sorts of things, right? Of course, Crito is the one saying, I'm willing to spend a lot of money to help you out. So you might think Socrates implicitly is saying, well, maybe you could just throw some money my kid's way after I'm dead. If, take the money you were going to use to bribe the guard and give it to my children. But he never responds to that. And it seems like there are two competing relevant moral interests here. One is our duties to the state, whatever those are. And the other are duties to family. And because he never examines in any serious way what our duties to our family are, he only focuses on the duties to the state. And the argument is going to be the following. We do have duties to obey what the state says in certain circumstances. And so if we violate those duties, if we do the wrong thing, we will do violence to our own souls, and our life will no longer be worth living. This is a kind of argument that Plato is going to go way into in some of his later dialogues in explaining why, in general, you should obey moral rules. And you see a hint of it here. But that means that the rest of this dialogue is going to be focused on our duties to the state and what those duties are. And to examine this, Socrates does a fairly interesting thing, an odd thing. Something he does in a couple other places in the dialogue, in Plato's dialogues. And it's interesting to think about, and I'm not going to be able to go into it very much, why he does this, but he, in essence, turns the argument over to someone who's not there. In this case, he asks, all right, how would we feel, or what would we say rather, not how would we feel, what would we say if the laws of Athens themselves came and made their case to us? And he speaks for an extended portion of this dialogue as though he were the laws made manifest. He does a similar thing in another dialogue called the Symposium, where at the key point in the dialogue, he says, well, let me tell you what this wise woman once told me. And then he just says what he's going to say as though he's the wise woman. It's a peculiar dramatic device. There's probably something interesting and important behind it. But instead of focusing on what that dramatic element is supposed to tell us, we're just going to focus on what the laws made manifest say, according to Socrates. All right. So we get here where the laws are supposed to be, in a sense, speaking to Socrates and Crito. And let me make this a little bigger. So here's what the laws say. Tell me, Socrates, what are you intending to do? Do you not, by this action you are attempting, intend to destroy us, the laws, and indeed the whole city as far as you are concerned? Or do you think it is possible for a city not to be destroyed if the verdicts of its courts have no force but are nullified and set at naught by private citizens? What shall we answer to this and other such arguments? For many things could be said, especially by an order on behalf of this law we are destroying, which orders that the judgments of the court shall be carried out. Shall we say in answer, the city wronged me and its decision was not right? Shall we say that or what? And Crito says yes. So we have a little argument here. And the argument, and this is all part of the argument that we have duties to the state, says that disobedience destroys the law. Destroys the law and the city. Now, this is a peculiar claim. Also, there's this talk of agreement that comes later. The laws respond. Was that the agreement between us, Socrates, or was it to respect the judgments that the city came to? Okay, so Socrates imagines that the laws in their defense would say that in violating the law, Socrates destroys the law, and that in destroying the law, it destroys the city. Now, that second claim seems right. If there are no laws, because they've all been destroyed, right, then it doesn't seem like a city could exist. It doesn't seem like any social situation can exist, any social gathering can exist without some laws governing how people interact with each other. But that first part of the claim, that disobedience to the law destroys the law, is a little bit peculiar because, after all, if Socrates gets out of prison and leaves Athens, it's not true that the laws will have no force. It's not true that the city will fall apart. And in fact, Socrates sort of recognizes this because as he goes on, he talks about destroying the law so far as you are able. Acknowledging that, of course, Socrates himself can't destroy the law. Socrates himself is unable to do that. But he is still doing something that will tend to destroy the law. He's destroying the law so far as he is able. Now, what does that mean? Well, just recognize the simple fact that a law that nobody obeys stops effectively being a law. Right? If everybody disobeys it and successfully disobeys it, then while it might still be in the law books, it has no force anymore. There are lots of laws like this. I live in Maryland. It is illegal. Or at least when I was in college years ago, it was still on the books that it was illegal to spit while walking down the street in Maryland. No one obeys this law. No one enforces that law. In a real sense, it's no longer a law. Persistent disobedience by a large number of people does seem as though it will destroy the law, which means that Socrates would, in disobeying the law successfully, in a sense, be doing his part to destroy the law. But what this means is that Socrates isn't saying it's the actual consequences of his behavior that they need to worry about. It's the consequences of what would happen or the consequences of everybody doing as he does. Which means that Socrates is implicitly appealing to something we're going to come across a lot of times in this course while looking at ethical thought. He's talking about universalizing. He's saying we shouldn't just focus on what will happen if we do something. We should focus on what would happen if everybody does that same kind of thing. Obviously, if everybody starts just disobeying the laws whenever it doesn't work to their benefit, then the laws will be destroyed. And if that happens to enough laws, the city will be destroyed. Of course, given my example earlier about spitting, right? It is not the case that because the law against spitting along the side of the road in Maryland is no longer honored, that Maryland falls apart, right? But if enough laws start being disrespected, disobeyed, and done so with impunity, then they will. And so what you see here is that Socrates is appealing to the claim that you shouldn't do things when it's the case that if everybody did them, it would have a bad result, a result like the destruction of the laws and therefore the city. Now that is on its own an impressive and powerful argument. There's a bad result if everybody does as you do, so you shouldn't do it. Further, though, he has the laws talk about an agreement. And that brings an extra sort of moral consideration in, not just the universalization idea, but also the idea that in some sense Socrates promised or agreed to obey the law. And that promise or that agreement should carry forward, right? It should cover not just the laws that he wants to obey, but the laws that he doesn't want to obey. So if you continue on, Socrates has the law start talking about, well, the city has done a lot for you. And you obeyed the laws when the city was doing things that helped you. And so you should obey the laws when the city does things that don't help you, because you agree to obey or not obey in general. You don't agree to obey when it suits you and disagree or disobey when it suits you, right? If that was the way that everybody interacted with the state and with the laws, then we would be in that situation where the laws don't get obeyed regularly. Every time the laws don't work to someone's benefit. Right? And so Socrates is imagining our relationship with the laws, and so with everybody else, to be in a sense, a voluntary relationship, and a voluntary relationship that we've all promised to stay in. You can think of it like a marriage, right? When you get married to someone, you don't promise to just stay married as long as it's fun, right? I mean, I guess some people in effect do, but if you pay attention to the traditional vows, right, in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer, you're promising to stick with them throughout all of it. And, why would you put your life in someone's hands the way you do when you get married to them? Right? You put not just your feelings, but, your future in their hands, and they put theirs in yours. If you thought they were going to bail as soon as it was convenient for them. Well, similarly, why would you be in a society? Why would you live in a city with someone? Why would you live under the same laws as someone if you know that they're going to disobey the laws as soon as it's convenient for them? And so what's going on here is you can almost see it as part of the reason why you have to care about the universalization thing, and it's effectively because you promised. Right? You promised to obey whether or not it worked out for you. And you can see that you promised to obey because you were obeying the laws before this. Right? The promise might not be explicit, but it's implicit. Here, Plato is anticipating stuff that would be, in a sense, rediscovered many, many, many years later. This idea that society is a voluntary compact or a voluntary set of promises by people to each other is one that gets associated with great thinkers far in our past, but even farther in Plato's future, like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. This is called the social contract theory. But Plato has it right here. You should obey the laws because in effect you promise to. And the promise only makes sense if it's a promise to obey in general. So we have a couple arguments. We have an argument that, an implicit argument that if everybody does this, it'll destroy the city, so you shouldn't do it. We also have the fact that you promised to do it. Implicitly, though, there's also a sense that the laws have done, or really the city has done so much good for Socrates that Socrates owes a debt of gratitude, right? So part of the purpose of pointing out all these things that worked out well for Socrates, right? So, for example, did we not first bring you to birth? Was it not through us that your father married your mother and begat you, right? And then there's later examples. There's all these things that worked out well for Socrates. So in addition, Socrates has a debt of gratitude. And so there's all these reasons to obey the law, even when it's wrong. So that's the position of the Crito. There are general moral reasons to obey the law, even when it gets the wrong answer. The position that the laws are in, and this is or the position that the laws are advancing, according to Socrates, is, and this is an important addendum here, that Socrates has to persuade or obey. The laws say, look, we gave you a chance to make your case, right? And you didn't succeed in persuading the people that you were innocent, or at least you didn't persuade them that you shouldn't be killed. And so now it's your duty to obey. So here's the position. You have a general duty to persuade the city to not do something bad to you, or you have to obey. And the reason is that you have general duties to obey the law. General duties having to do with gratitude towards the city, but more importantly, probably, the fact that you effectively promise to obey all the laws. And so in this case, to violate the laws would be wrong, and so to do so would be to harm your own soul, so you shouldn't do it. He never considers the idea that maybe his duties to his family take precedence over the duties to the state. That's an interesting question, but it's just sort of not dealt with in any serious length. But now the question is, how do you square the Crito's position with the position found in the Apology? And I think part of the way to see how this is consistent is that in the Apology, when he was violating the commands of the city, he was doing so to avoid hurting someone else. But the only person who stands to be hurt in obeying his death sentence is himself. So what I would suggest is that Socrates' position, or Plato's position really, is this. You may violate the laws when the laws demand of you that you unjustly harm someone else. But you have to accept and obey the laws even when they're wrong, when they're only going to hurt you. Now, there is this, here's where that point I've mentioned a couple times, the fact that one of the points Crito raised is, well, your children are going to get screwed by this. That seems to me, anyway, to make this more like some of those cases in the Apology where people will get hurt. Innocent people will be harmed if Socrates obeys this law. But again, the Crito doesn't go deeply into that. So here we have seemingly a fairly unified position. When it is the case that you have the chance to persuade the people to not harm you, then you're in the position where you have to obey their judgment. Now, this suggests that Socrates thinks that you probably don't have a duty to obey the law when no opportunity has been given for you to persuade the law or the government to do or not do something, which might be an argument for democracy, despite his many critical claims about the wisdom of the majority. Right? And that's something to keep in mind here. Socrates clearly thinks democracy can make bad decisions, that the majority aren't always right. He makes this point over and over again. And that's what makes this a compelling argument, because, of course, if your claim is just that the laws are always right, well, then that's more like the gods, right? The gods are always right. They're not the source of morality, but they're always right about what morality says. When it comes to the law, they're not only not the source of morality, they're often wrong about morality. They're often wrong about what the right thing to do is. But Socrates thinks, if you were given a chance to persuade the government, if you were given a chance to sort of shape its judgment, and you fail, then these general moral arguments, right, about gratitude, about holding to your word, even if it was implicitly given, and about not doing things that would, if everyone else did them, destroy the city. These general moral reasons mean you have a duty to obey the state, except when the state is asking you to wrong someone else. The situation that Socrates was in with that case of Leon of Salamis, who was described in the Apology, that's a situation where either way, he had to do some harm. He either had to harm Leon or he had to harm the state. Now, that's complicated by the fact that in that case, it was the 30 tyrants and not the democracy, so maybe he doesn't have the ability to persuade. But it seems to me there's a consistent position at work here across the Euthyphro, Apology, and Crito, and it is a nuanced and subtle position.